This is my new novel, When We Fall. It's set during the Second World War, but it opens on the 10th of April 2010, when an elderly woman on the south coast of England hears the report on the radio about the crash of an airliner carrying Poland's top dignitaries, including the president, which has killed all 96 people on board. They were on their way to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the massacres at Katyn, one of the most notorious war crimes of the Second World War, when over 22,000 Polish prisoners of war being held in Soviet Russia were murdered. For the old lady in my story, news of the plane crash triggers an onslaught of dangerous memories about her own part in Poland's war. So why did I open my wartime novel with a scene set 10 years ago? Well, when I started off on the journey of writing a World War II novel, I only knew that I wanted to write about women at the sharp end of the conflict, the women who wore uniform and put their lives on the line, the women who took up arms and fought. On the actual day of the Polish air disaster in 2010, I was starting to write a novel about British women pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary, the amazing air women who flew all types of warplane from factories and maintenance units to RAF airfields. I was entranced by the excitement and glamour and the danger of their world in the skies above wartime Britain. But the events on the 10th of April 2010 changed the focus of my story completely, because it was then that I found out about another wartime woman pilot, one whose life ended at Katyn in 1940. Her name was Janina Lewandowska, and she was the only female victim found amongst thousands of bodies of men in the mass graves at Katyn. She appears only briefly as a character in my fictional story, but her fate is at the heart of my novel. So how did one solitary woman become caught up in this atrocity at Katyn? Well, to answer that, I need to tell you a bit about Janina's remarkable life. Like many young women of her generation, she grew up entranced by the novelty of flight and determined to fly aircraft herself. She came from a privileged military family. Her father was a hero of Poland's struggle for independence in 1919, and she grew up on the family estate near Poznan in western Poland. Bubbly and adventurous, Janina became an enthusiastic member of the Poznan Aero Club. She learnt to fly gliders and excelled at parachuting. She actually achieved the world record for the highest parachute jump by a woman at 5 kilometres high. Once she gained a pilot's licence in 1938, she joined the Air Force Reserve. And so, when Germany invaded Poland from the west on the 1st of September 1939 and war broke out, Janina was called up to join the Polish Air Force and given the rank of second lieutenant. Throughout September 1939, Polish forces put up a fierce fight against the Germans. But when the Soviet Union joined as Hitler's ally and invaded Poland from the east, the country was overwhelmed. Hundreds of thousands of Polish military personnel were taken prisoner, Janina amongst them. Most of these prisoners, held by the Soviet Red Army, were sent to camps in Siberia, but the officers, including Janina, were singled out and sent to 3 prison camps in western Russia. Janina spent the winter in the old monastery citadel at Kozielsk, which had been converted into a prisoner of war camp. We know that she was the only woman in the camp and held in virtual solitary confinement, but eyewitnesses describe her striding around the camp with her guards, a striking sight in her Air Force blue uniform. Conditions through that freezing winter were harsh, but the prisoners were allowed letters and parcels from home, and most of them thought that come the spring thaw, they would be sent back to Poland. and so many of them, perhaps including Janina, were hopeful when they were transported out of the camp. But their journey by bus and train led only to the forests of Katyn. No one knows for sure what happened to Janina, but we do know that, like all the other thousands of Polish officers, she was killed by a single bullet to the back of the head and buried in a mass grave under the trees in the forest at Katyn. But what did the Soviet Union have to gain from the murder of so many prisoners of war who had already been in captivity for 6 months? No one knows for sure. In Poland, the prisoners' families must have been beside themselves with worry when letters from the prison camps stopped abruptly in April 1940. Many of those families would never find out what had happened to their loved ones. In fact, the prisoners' fates had been sealed in March 1940 when the head of the Soviet secret police recommended that the Polish officers held in captivity should be executed as nationalists and counter-revolutionaries. For reasons that are not entirely clear, the Soviet president Joseph Stalin gave his assent. Perhaps the killings were an extension of the Soviet state's Great Purge of the 1930s, the political murders which often targeted citizens with Polish heritage. Stalin had never forgiven Poland for defeating his own forces in 1920 during the Polish-Soviet War. In 1940, many of the Polish officers who died at Katyn were reservists who had been the core of the country's professional middle class. The massacres wiped out around 40% of Poland's doctors, as well as lawyers, engineers, teachers and journalists. And it could be argued, given Poland's post-war history, that if this genocide was part of Stalin's strategy to cripple Poland's independence, it was highly effective. In the following year of the war, everything changed when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Hitler's former ally, Joseph Stalin, became his enemy. When Stalin turned to Britain to join an alliance against Hitler, questions were asked about the missing Polish officers. But Stalin just replied with a vague excuse that they'd been sent to the east and then had disappeared from prison records. In 1941, this excuse was good enough. For Churchill, the importance of a pact with the mighty Soviet Union overrode every other consideration. So how was Janina's fate eventually discovered? Well, in 1943, 3 years after her death, German forces occupying the area around Katyn discovered huge shallow graves containing thousands of decaying corpses, all wearing Polish uniforms. The Germans said that these must be the missing Polish officers killed by the Soviet Union. But this was dismissed by the Allies as a hoax. The British government said that the Nazis themselves must be to blame for the deaths. The German authorities did their best to convince the world otherwise. They invited a multinational Red Cross commission to visit the exhumations at Katyn, and they set up a team of forensic scientists to carefully preserve dated evidence found on the bodies. But the world would not believe them. The Nazis had already committed too many atrocities of their own to be able to point the finger for this one at their former ally, Stalin. Among the bodies was found one that was unmistakably female. For some reason, the Nazi authorities kept this fact a secret, but the remains were carefully labelled corpse of a pilot officer and sent for storage at what was then Breslau University. And how did the truth about Katyn eventually emerge? Well, after the war in communist Poland, the very mention of Katyn was taboo. Families who had lost a loved one in the massacre had to keep it a secret because jobs, university places, and even friendships might all be jeopardised if a personal connection to this toxic subject came to light. Even Britain and America were complicit in the cover-up of the truth about this war crime. The world was now in the grip of another war, the Cold War, and no one in the West wanted to risk nuclear annihilation by stirring up a controversy from the past, especially when most of the relatives of the Katyn victims were living behind the Iron Curtain. Finally, after 50 years of fake news about the massacres, the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed the truth about Katyn to emerge. In 1990, President Gorbachev first admitted Soviet responsibility for the deaths of the Polish officers. And in the 20 years after that, more evidence emerged about their grim fate. In a final act of reconciliation on the 7th of April 2010, Prime Ministers Vladimir Putin of Russia and Donald Tusk of Poland together laid wreaths in the Forest Memorial at Katyn. But then, 3 days later, came the plane crash that appears in the opening of my novel, the one that killed all the Polish dignitaries, including President Kaczynski. The repercussions of this modern twist in the Katyn tragedy and the conspiracy theories that it generated still rebound through Polish cultural and political life. And what happened in the end to Janina's remains? Well, when the border between Germany and Poland moved west after the war, the city that had been Breslau in Germany now became Wrocław in Poland. But the carefully labelled corpse of a pilot officer that the Germans had unearthed from the mass graves at Katyn was still being carefully stored in the university's Department of Forensic Medicine. Once the Soviet Union was dismantled and Poland had become the European democracy that it is today, the story about Katyn's only female victim could at last be told. In 2005, after a full examination and identification, Janina's remains were laid to rest in the family plot at Lusowo near Poznan. In the same grave were the recently interred remains of Janina's younger sister, Agnieszka. Just like Eva, the heroine of my novel, When We Fall, Agnieszka had joined the Polish resistance at the start of the war and taken part in acts of insurgency against the German occupiers. But, like so many of the brave women of World War II who were active combatants against the Nazis, Agnieszka was arrested and then executed by the Gestapo. In the spring and early summer of 1940, both sisters were killed by a single bullet and buried in shallow graves. Agnieszka by the hands of the Germans, Janina by their then allies, the Soviets. In 2005, they were at last reunited in their final resting place. In my novel, When We Fall, the fictional character Eva, who is also a partisan in the Polish resistance, takes a rather different path. Eva's fate becomes entwined with that of her lost fiancé, Stefan, as well as his English lover, V, who is a ferry pilot with Air Transport Auxiliary. The three of them are bound together by Stefan's desperate quest for justice following his fatal choice during the horror of the massacres at Katyn. And only one of these three will live long enough to witness the long aftermath of the tragedy at Katyn and the air disaster on the 10th of April 2010. I hope you might now be interested to read When We Fall and to find out more about the wartime events which are being commemorated in anniversaries this year.